March 7, 1945, 4:35 p.m., East Bank of the Rhine, Remagen, Germany. Private Thomas Bennett, a medic with the 9th Armored Division, moved through the smoking ruins of a former German defensive position. Hours earlier, the Ludendorff Bridge, which had miraculously remained intact despite German attempts to blow it up, had carried American troops across the Rhine into the heart of Germany. The defenders, who had failed to destroy it, lay scattered among the fortifications. Bennett heard the sound before he saw its source, a high-pitched whimper that did not match the usual sounds of wounded war veterans. He followed it to a crater where a German soldier crouched against a clay wall, clutching his left leg. Blood seeped through his fingers. He held a pistol in his right hand, but the trembling indicated that he lacked either the will or the strength to use it. As Bennett approached, the German raised the pistol with trembling hands. Now Bennett could see his face clearly, smooth cheeks barely marked by puberty, eyes wide with terror, lips moving in what looked like a prayer. The uniform hung loosely on a body that had looked malnourished even before the battle. This was not a soldier. This was a child wearing a soldier's uniform. "Calm down, son," Bennett said quietly, raising his empty hands. "Medic, medic." The boy's hand holding the gun trembled, his face contorted with confusion and fear. As Bennett took another step toward him, the German threw the pistol aside, pressed himself against the crater wall and began to sob. Not the controlled tears of a man, but the helpless crying of a frightened child who had reached the absolute limit of what he could bear. Bennett knelt beside him and gently took the boy's hands away from the leg wound. Shrapnel had torn his calf, but it wasn't arterial bleeding. He would survive. Bennett took out his first aid kit and began treating the wound, while the German teenager watched with a completely blank expression, as if Bennett were performing magic rather than basic trauma care. "You're going to be okay," Bennett said, even though he knew the boy probably didn't understand English, but hoping that the tone of his voice would convey what words could not. "You're safe now." The German boy stared at Bennett's hands as he cleaned the wound, applied sulfur powder, and wrapped clean bandages around his calf. When Bennett offered him his canteen, the boy took it with trembling hands and drank as if he hadn't had clean water in days. Then he looked Bennett straight in the face and whispered a single German word that needed no translation. "Why? Why?" Bennett had no answer that fit into his limited German vocabulary. He just shrugged, patted the boy gently on the shoulder, and set off in search of the next wounded soldier who needed help. He left the German teenager sitting in the crater, where he stared at the clean bandage on his leg as if it were proof of something that had been sold to him as impossible. The child army of the Reich's collapse. By March 1945, Nazi Germany's systematic destruction of its own future had reached its logical climax. Children were desperately fighting professional armies, while the regime that had betrayed them collapsed around them. The Volkssturm and Hitler Youth conscriptions had evolved from a desperate measure into common practice, sending young bodies into a military meat grinder that devoured them without any significant strategic effect. The statistics documented the institutional sacrifice of children. Members of the Hitler Youth aged 15 to 17 in combat missions, January to May 1945, approximately 80,000 to 100,000. Teenage fatalities in the last 5 months, an estimated 20,000 to 25,000 dead, 30,000 to 40,000 wounded. German teenage prisoners of war captured by American forces from March to May 1945, approximately 35,000 to 45,000. Teenage prisoners of war, wounded and requiring medical treatment, approximately 15,000 to 18,000. Average age of captured Hitler Youth fighters, 16.3 years. Percentage of those who believed that the Americans executed prisoners, approximately 85 to 90%. Average training period before deployment, 5 to 10 days. The young soldiers captured by American forces had been systematically conditioned to expect execution or torture if captured. For years, Nazi propaganda had portrayed Americans as barbaric monsters who showed no mercy to prisoners, especially young soldiers who embodied the future of German resistance. The indoctrination was so complete that many teenage prisoners of war preferred to commit suicide rather than be captured, as they sincerely believed that death by their own hand was better than what the Americans would do to them. This psychological conditioning presented tactical problems for the American forces. German teenage soldiers fought with a suicidal desperation that stemmed not from courage but from fear of capture. They could not surrender because surrender meant torture and death. The propaganda intended to strengthen resistance instead created situations in which frightened children preferred to fight to the death rather than be captured by enemies they considered demons. The shock of survival. For young German prisoners of war who had been conditioned to expect execution, The discovery that American medics were actually trying to save their lives led to psychological disorientation that was as profound as the physical trauma. The systematic friendliness contradicted everything they had been taught about the character of Americans and military practice. The initial reaction was often disbelief. Wounded teenage prisoners of war watched the American medics treating their injuries with an expression that suggested they thought they were hallucinating or were victims of an elaborate deception that would end in cruelty. Some initially refused treatment, preferring to die untreated rather than face the torture they believed would precede medical care. 16-year-old Klaus Richter, who had been captured near Cologne with severe burns, described his mental state as follows. "I had been taught that the Americans skinned prisoners alive and tortured young soldiers because we represented future resistance. When the American medic began treating my burns, gently, carefully, administering morphine for the pain, I thought I was already dead and that this was some kind of hallucination in the afterlife. I couldn't comprehend that the enemy was helping me survive." The moment of realization, when the young prisoners of war understood that the American medical care was real and not the prelude to their execution, often led to emotional breakdowns. Boys who had remained stoically calm during their captivity suddenly began to cry uncontrollably when they realized they were not going to die, that the propaganda had been lies, that their enemies were treating them with more humanity than their own government. The psychological transformation took place very quickly for most of the young prisoners of war. Within hours of receiving medical care, fear disappeared and was replaced by confusion, gratitude, and cautious trust. The speed of this transformation showed how superficial the propaganda had been. It was based on fear rather than genuine conviction and collapsed immediately when confronted with contradictory evidence. American field hospitals set up behind the advancing front lines became places where former enemies discovered their common humanity through the universal experience of pain, healing, and medical care. Wounded German prisoners of war in their teens were treated in the same facilities as wounded American soldiers, often in neighboring beds, and cared for by the same medical staff. The proximity forced them to acknowledge their shared humanity, which had been obscured by the conditions of combat. American soldiers recovering from their wounds lay next to German teenagers recovering from similar injuries. The shared experience of being patients rather than combatants created common ground where nationality and uniform were less important than the universal desire to survive and recover. Medical personnel, doctors, nurses, medics, and orderlies, made no distinctions based on nationality in the quality of care they provided. German teenage prisoners of war received the same antibiotics, the same surgical procedures, the same painkillers, and the same care as American patients. This equal treatment demonstrated values that, according to propaganda, were not inherent to Americans. Staff Sergeant Edward Morrison, a surgical technician at a field hospital near Frankfurt, described the dynamics on the ward. "We had American and German children on the same ward, all wounded, all frightened, all wanting to go home. The German teenagers watched us treat our own wounded and then realized they were receiving the same care. You could see it in their faces. The propaganda crumbled and was replaced by the understanding that we actually cared whether they lived or died." The field hospitals also became places of cultural exchange. Despite the language barriers, American patients shared candy and cigarettes with German teenagers in neighboring beds. Nurses learned German phrases to communicate with young prisoners of war. German teenagers practiced English words, asked questions about America, and showed photos of families they missed. The end of indoctrination. Medical care provided by the American Armed Forces became the most effective tool of denazification for captured German teenage soldiers. No amount of intensive re-education could match the persuasive power of experiencing mercy from people who had been taught to be merciless, care from enemies who had been portrayed as monsters in propaganda. The psychological effect was evident on several levels. The immediate experience of medical treatment contradicted specific propaganda statements about the brutality of the Americans. The sustained quality of care demonstrated a systematic commitment to humanitarian values and was not an individual exception. The professional competence of the American medical staff revealed an organizational sophistication that contradicted Nazi claims about democratic decadence and chaos. 17-year-old Hermann Schultz, who had been wounded during the fighting in the Ruhr, described his transformation. "I had spent 3 years in the Hitler Youth and learned that Americans were subhuman criminals who would torture and execute German prisoners. Within 48 hours of my capture, American medics had saved my life. American nurses had cared for me better than my own military hospitals could, and American soldiers had shared their food with me. Everything I had been taught turned out to be a lie. The medical care not only healed my wounds, it also destroyed my belief in Nazi ideology." Denazification through medical care proved more effective than formal programs because it was based on experience rather than education. The young prisoners of war did not read about American values or listen to lectures on democracy. They experienced firsthand that Americans treated wounded enemies with dignity, that democratic societies could be both strong and compassionate, and that military power did not require cruelty. The burden of the medics. For the American medics who treated young German prisoners of war, this work involved psychological stresses that surpassed even the trauma of treating wounded American soldiers. They faced the moral dilemma of having to save the lives of young enemies who had just wounded them or their comrades in battle, while at the same time struggling with their anger at a regime that had sent children to their deaths. The medics often experienced conflicting emotions simultaneously: professional satisfaction at saving lives, anger at the Nazi leaders who had sacrificed children, sadness for the youth these boys had lost to the war, guilt over the American actions that had wounded them, and pride in demonstrating American values through medical care. Private First Class Robert Henderson kept a diary in which he documented his experiences treating teenage German prisoners of war near Magdeburg. "Today I treated a 15-year-old boy, shrapnel wounds to his chest and arm. He was afraid when I approached him and kept trying to crawl away despite his injuries. When I was finally close enough to treat him, he cried and pleaded in German. I think he was asking me to kill him quickly instead of torturing him. When he realized that I was actually bandaging his wounds, he looked at me as if I were performing a miracle. I saved his life. I don't know how I should feel about that. Yesterday he tried to kill Americans, but he's just a kid who had no choice. This war is completely wrong." The emotional strain was particularly great for medics who were themselves young men in their early 20s, treating boys only a few years younger than themselves. The small age difference made identification easier and more painful. These medics could empathize with the teenage prisoners of war and recognized how thin the line was between their own lives and the lives of the enemies they were treating. Some medics coped by adopting a paternal attitude toward the teenage prisoners of war, treating them more like surrogate sons or little brothers than enemies. Others maintained strict professional distance and focused on medical tasks rather than emotional attachments. Most struggled to find a balance between compassion, which made their work meaningful, and distance, which made it bearable. The Geneva Convention in practice. The medical doctrine of the American military made no distinctions based on age, nationality, or military status when treating wounded combatants. The provisions of the Geneva Convention on medical neutrality were reinforced by training that emphasized that all wounded should be treated as patients, not enemies. Medics in combat were explicitly instructed that their job was to save lives, regardless of what uniform those people wore. But this doctrine faced a complicated emotional reality when the wounded enemies were obviously children. American medics who had treated wounded Wehrmacht veterans throughout the European campaign suddenly found themselves caring for boys who looked young enough to be their sons or little brothers. The cognitive dissonance between enemy combatant and wounded child created moral and psychological challenges that had not been addressed in medical training. Corporal James Walsh, a medic with the 1st Infantry Division, described the emotional conflict in a letter to his wife. "We treat German wounded just like our own. That's the Geneva Convention and Army doctrine. But when the wounded German is 15 years old and crying for his mother while you're treating him, it's impossible to maintain professional distance. You don't see an enemy soldier, you just see a frightened child who should be in school and not bleeding to death in a foxhole." Medical care for teenage German prisoners of war often went beyond the minimum requirements of the Geneva Convention. Medics gave them extra morphine to alleviate not only physical pain, but also psychological trauma. They took extra time to encourage them in broken German, shared cigarettes and candy with them, provided them with comfort items from their personal supplies, and generally treated the young prisoners of war with paternal care that went beyond clinical medical necessity. The lasting bonds. In many cases, the medical treatment led to relationships between American medics and teenage German prisoners of war that lasted beyond the immediate crisis of field medicine. The medics cared for the young prisoners of war during their recovery, brought them extra food, helped them write letters to their families, and advocated for their transfer to better facilities. The bonds transcended the formal structure of prisoners and captors, medics and patients, victors and vanquished. Relationships developed between people who had shared intense experiences, between those who had saved lives and those whose lives had been saved. The shared experiences created connections that could not be adequately categorized in military terms or national identities. Technical Sergeant Michael Romano, a senior medic who had treated dozens of teenage German prisoners of war, remained in correspondence with some of them after the war ended. In a letter to his wife in 1946, he explained these connections. These children did not choose the war or the ideology. They were victims just like our own wounded soldiers. When you save someone's life, you become responsible for that life in a way. I can't just turn away from the boys I treated and pretend they don't matter. They matter because they are human beings who deserve better than what their government gave them. Post-war correspondence between American medics and former teenage prisoners of war documents, enduring relationships that defy simple categorization. The letters were about recovery, reconstruction, and hopes for the future. They expressed gratitude that transcended national boundaries and wartime hostilities. They proved that compassion during war can lay the foundation for peace after it ends. Transformation through care. The systematic medical care of young German prisoners of war led to a transformation that took place on both an individual and collective level. Individual young people discovered that enemies can be compassionate. Collectively, a generation of young Germans experienced American values through direct action rather than propaganda. This transformation influenced the attitude of Germans toward America and democracy in the post-war period. Young men who had experienced American medical care became advocates for rapprochement with the West in the political debates of the Cold War. They told their families, friends, and eventually their own children about American medics who had saved their lives, while Nazi propaganda had promised only death. Medical care also influenced Americans' self-image regarding the significance of their military service. Medics, who had treated teenage German prisoners of war, found meaning in their service that went beyond military victory. They had saved the lives of enemies, even though they could have let them die. They showed that American values included mercy toward the vanquished, especially toward young enemies who had never chosen sides. The last memory. On March 7, 1995, 50 years after the crossing of the Remagen Bridge, 80-year-old Thomas Bennett attended a memorial service in Germany. After the official ceremonies, a man approached him who limped slightly, but otherwise looked healthy and prosperous, and was wearing a business suit. He looked closely at Bennett's face and then spoke in accented English. "Medic Bennett, you treated my leg wound when the Americans took the bridge. I was 16 years old and expected to be executed. You saved my life and showed me that everything I had been taught about Americans was propaganda." Bennett, whose memories stretched back 5 decades, recognized something in the man's face. The echo of the frightened boy who had thrown away his gun and cried while Bennett bandaged his leg. "Klaus?" he asked hesitantly. "Klaus Richter," the German confirmed. "I live in Bonn now. I'm a doctor, a surgeon. I chose medicine because of what you did that day. You showed me that healing is stronger than hurting, that mercy is important even in war. I've spent my career trying to live up to the example you set when you treated an enemy child with the same care you would show a friend." Bennett, who was usually reserved, embraced the man who had once been a wounded boy. "I was just doing my job," he said quietly. "The Geneva Convention requires that all wounded be treated. That's what I did." "No," Richter insisted. "The convention dictates the minimum you had to do. You did more. You gave me comfort as well as medical care. You treated me as if I mattered, as if my life had value, even though just hours before I had been your enemy. That extra humanity, that changed me. I have tried to pass that on in my own medical career." The story of American medics treating teenage German prisoners of war never became a celebrated story. It was overshadowed by battle reports, strategic decisions, and dramatic victories on the battlefield. Providing medical care to wounded enemies does not produce compelling images or clear-cut heroes for mass consumption, but for the thousands of teenage German soldiers who would have died from their injuries without American medical help. The medics who treated them represented America's truest victory. Not the defeat of armies, but the proof that democratic values included mercy toward enemies, especially young enemies who had been betrayed by their own leaders. The teenagers who had expected to be executed and instead received medical care carried that experience with them throughout their lives. They became the generation that rebuilt Germany as a democracy, aligned itself with the West during the tensions of the Cold War, and taught their children that American soldiers had been liberators, not conquerors. And it began with medics kneeling beside wounded teenage enemies and treating them, even though they could have walked away, applying bandages even though they could have refused treatment, giving water, morphine, and comfort to boys who hours earlier had tried to kill Americans. They proved that compassion can survive even in the brutality of total war, that professional medical ethics can overcome national hatred, and that treating enemy children humanely creates a foundation for peace that military victory alone could never achieve. The bandages they wrapped around the legs and arms of German teenagers became bridges across the deepest chasm that war can create. And those bridges proved stronger than any bomb or bullet in building a peaceful Europe that emerged from the rubble of war.